Hello, welcome. This is the gender-based violence breakout session. So if there's anybody here who's supposed to be somewhere else, now is the right time to move. Can I just ask you all to move forward if you can? I know that these seats aren't the best, they're not the most comfortable, but this session is supposed to be something that's more intimate, more informal, so we want some audience participation as well, and we want to be able to share ideas. So if anybody is tempted to fill up these multicoloured seats, now's the time to move. Just by way of introduction, my name is Simab Sheikh. I'm a barrister from the UK. I actually practice in the area of family law, and I work with victims of gender-based violence, domestic violence, in particular. I have formerly worked in the area of immigration and asylum law, and again, in that context, I've worked with victims of gender-based violence. So hopefully, both myself and Juliette will be able to assist in terms of talking about our experiences of working with victims of GBV, but also learn from you as delegates at this symposium. Juliette, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself and tell everybody a bit about your background as well.
Yes, so I'm Dr. Juliette Cohen. I'm the head of doctors at a charity called Freedom from Torture in the UK, formerly known as the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture. And that's part of my work. So that part of the work is about training and supporting a group of doctors who provide medical legal reports on evidence of torture, principally for asylum claims. And as well as that, I'm an independent physician, forensic physician, and so I do medical reports on a wider group of victims of other forms of serious harm, such as trafficking, domestic violence, and brides brought to the UK from abroad, and other forms of exploitation. I've recently been involved in upgrading the European Union training program for immigration officers on interviewing vulnerable persons, which was a really interesting challenge where we looked at how they can really identify best practice in interviewing people with all sorts of different vulnerabilities. So gender-based violence was one of the big ones in that category. That's probably enough about me for now.
So in terms of this session, we'll be looking at different aspects of gender-based violence in a refugee context, and also specifically looking at claims of torture. So I want to touch on just a bit of background, looking at definitions of gender-based violence, not only in terms of from declarations from the UN, but also European interpretations. And then Juliette will be touching on some of the barriers from her perspective and her professional perspective of protecting victims from gender-based violence. And then thirdly, we will touch on some of the legal developments, jurisprudence that may help practitioners and those working in this area. I'll touch on perhaps a key case from the European Court of Human Rights, and also a few cases from the UK that look at torture specifically and sexual gender-based violence in addition to FGM, female genital mutilation. We'll then go on to consider some of the guidelines for suggestions of improvements and developments in this area, and fifthly, to look at how victims of sexual-based, gender-based violence are treated in Hong Kong when they make a claim for asylum. There will hopefully be an opportunity for questions and answers, but I'm conscious that lunch is served at 12:30, so we might have to speed through some of these topics. But I will certainly be around during the lunch break, and I think Juliette will be as well, so we can have more informal one-to-one discussions at that stage. So first of all, just touching on some of the definitions of gender-based violence. It encompasses a number of terms that you'll be familiar with. But I wanted to start by looking for a moment at the definition given by the UN Declaration on Elimination of Violence Against Women. And the definition that has been set out there effectively defines gender-based violence as violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women. Threats of such acts such as coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether in private or public life. And I think that's an important aspect to the definition, that there is no distinction between private or public life. Interestingly, the Council of Europe has, under the Istanbul Convention, adopted that same definition. And when we look to more local definitions of gender-based violence, for example, in the UK, although the Home Office, so the Home Department there, doesn't have a specific definition of gender-based violence, what it does do is have a strong emphasis on domestic violence and what that encompasses. There are references to this both within the Family Act and the Family Procedure Rules, that any incident which refers to controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence between partners and family members, it can encompass but not limited to psychological, physical or sexual forms of abuse, and also cultural specific forms of abuse. By that, it is referring to forced marriage, and a term which I'm slightly uncomfortable with, which is honour-based violence. But that encompasses forced marriage and also FGM. Certainly in the UK, what I can say is that the government have had a strategy in place since 2016 that has specifically looked at violence against women and girls. And that is supposed to reflect the government's commitment about ending, and the aim of ending violence against women and girls, both in the UK and interestingly abroad. There are specific references to developing programs and units to deal with forced marriage. So the forced marriage unit, which is a unit that is effectively run by the Home Office and in conjunction with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and also a unit to assist victims that is the female genital mutilation unit. There is also a clear reference within that strategy, interestingly, to ensure that the asylum system is gender sensitive, so that officials give serious consideration as to whether an asylum claimant is at risk of or has suffered gender-based violence. So when we think about the term gender-based violence, it not only encompasses physical or sexual acts, but perhaps other forms of abuse that are less familiar to certain parts of the world, such as FGM and forced marriage. So when we think about those definitions and what that means when dealing with such cases, what is perhaps not always apparent is that it's viewed as or construed as a form of torture. But it is also clear that rape and other forms of sexual violence can amount to and do amount to torture and ill treatment of women. Particularly, I would say that women are vulnerable to sexual violence as a form of control. And certainly we hear of that in claims relating to asylum and those seeking refuge from countries where they've been persecuted and where sexual violence has been used to try and intimidate, control or coerce women from certain countries due to their political beliefs or their religious beliefs or so forth. I just wanted to get an idea from you as delegates and practitioners in this area and those who are interested in this area about your experiences of how different states in this region interpret gender-based violence and whether there is a limited or restrictive definition of gender-based violence or whether there's an acknowledgement that it does form or constitute forms of torture. Are there anybody out there who wants to contribute? Yeah.
I think many times we overlook about gender-based violence against men as well as LGBT in relation to, in our context, the detention in the military. They use a lot of naked sessions against the suspects of insurgents in the Deep South. And it has been not documented. And the issue was not, we cannot talk openly, so just someone like us to speak, it seems to be an imagination. It doesn't seem to be real in the Thai context. So it has been difficult to communicate to the population in general that it had happened, and it's very difficult to prove. It's very difficult to make it acceptable that is a kind of gender-based violence, because we have presumption that gender-based violence is against women. And another thing is that the women has been also used to join or to be a part of that naked sessions to humiliating the populations who are the Muslim. And those women were, I don't know, the paramilitary women were forced to stay to see the naked guy in front of them, or they enjoy participating in that interrogation with the naked.
Thank you. That's a really interesting perspective to touch on male violence as well, because certainly when you look at the definitions of the international legal instruments, they are interpreted as violence specifically against women. I want to move on, if I can, to look at some of the barriers to providing protection from gender-based violence. Now, I think Juliette's in a valuable, unique position to address you on that, certainly from her experiences, and some of the difficulties and challenges to those wanting to report or disclosures being made and the barriers in relation to that. Are you able to assist in terms of that?
I mean, this is something that really comes up daily in my work. The difficulty that people have in disclosing experiences of sexual violence is so great that sometimes I'm really amazed that people do disclose at first instance at all, because I really can't imagine how difficult that must be for them to be in a situation where not only have they suffered this horrific crime, but then they're being asked to talk about intimate details of it to someone who is an authority figure whom they've never met before, who they have no idea if they can trust, with an interpreter who they've never met before, who they have no idea if they can trust. So just these simple mechanical barriers, I think, do deter a huge number of people from feeling that they can talk about what happened to them. External barriers like this are really very important, because they are perhaps the ones that we could do most about in terms of making sure that we explain about the code of conduct of interpreters, their professional requirements to keep confidentiality, because this is often somebody's biggest fear, that whatever they say will immediately be spoken about in their community and bring more shame and more stigma and possibly risk of violence to them, being outcast from their family, lose their children, all kinds of other consequences for them if what has happened becomes generally known. So that is probably the first barrier that needs to be overcome. And the second one is for the person who is asking the questions to be able to establish a relationship of sufficient trust that it feels safe enough to start to talk about these things. And that can be quite difficult to teach people. We teach the doctors that I train on medical report writing some of these aspects, and we have had some success in trying to also reach out to the immigration officials about how they should go about establishing a better relationship of trust by the sort of information that they give and how they conduct themselves in their nonverbal cues to establish better trust. Because for everyone who has suffered some form of sexual violence, there are also these enormous internal barriers to disclosing it. There is an enormous sense of shame which seems to be attached to every experience of sexual violence. And shame is an emotion that none of us ever want to live, re-experience any more than we have to. Sometimes I do this in training. If you ask somebody to just imagine an experience that you had when you were a bit scared, perhaps you had a near miss in the car or on a bicycle, you nearly got injured and it was a bit scary. And then if you try to imagine a similar low-level experience of embarrassment about not handing your homework in on time when you were at school, coming in the wrong uniform to school, something like that. It's pretty embarrassing and awkward. If you have to talk about either of those not very serious examples to somebody else, I guarantee everybody would choose the fear one. It's so much easier to talk about something that was scary, we survived it, it's okay, it's socially acceptable to have been a bit scared and then got away. But it's not socially acceptable to be embarrassed and to talk about it. It's something that is an emotion that just stays with us and engulfs us every time we access that memory. So then if you imagine what it must be like for someone who's experienced sexual violence, which is off the scale compared to these trivial kinds of examples that I mentioned, it's so difficult for them to want to revisit that memory because of the associated emotions. And there will be fear as well, of course, very extreme fear, but a lot of shame and humiliation. So that's their first barrier, is can they even begin to face re-experiencing those emotions? And then there is the stigma. How will they be judged? What will happen to that person who's been quite nice to them up to now? What will that person think about them now if they know what kind of person they are? Because there's something about sexual violence that people feel guilty. They feel that somehow they brought it on themselves, somehow they're now marked, people will recognize them as a victim of sexual violence, they will be viewed differently, treated differently from now on forever. And that's something, again, that they desperately want to avoid. There is that fear of violence, fear of retribution from the community, from family, that there is no place of safety, that nobody wants to actually look after them anymore, when, of course, their number one feeling is that they would like someone to look after them. So all of these things operate tremendous barriers to disclosure and make it very, very difficult for people. And I really want to echo the comment from colleague over there about the effect of this kind of sexual violence on men. I really don't think that it enough is talked about, the difficulties that male victims have, and male victims in detention who are tortured. enormous numbers of them suffer a form of sexual violence, sexual torture, because that's what torture is. Very, very often it's also sexual torture, whether it stops at forced nakedness or progresses to other forms of sexual violence. If we think that it's hard for women to talk about it, at least in most societies, there is kind of an expectation that women are less powerful physically, more vulnerable to sexual violence. But for a man to experience sexual violence, it transgresses even more about their identity, their gender identity, their sexuality, who they are as people, is destroyed in a different way than it is for a woman. And you can't weigh up how much harm is done to either person. It's not what we're talking about. But I'm simply talking about the fact that for men there is that additional transgression, perhaps, of their very identity. And I think there's also an issue where I've seen decisions that if a man is a homosexual, well then he could be raped and that's nothing. That doesn't even count as sexual violence, which brings its own kind of horror that somebody would think that any kind of sexual violence to another person somehow has a different weight or different crime attached to it, depending on that person's sexual orientation. So all these issues about sexual orientation, gender identity, I think we have to enlarge from only thinking of women and girls as victims. All humans can be victims, whatever their nature. And a subgroup, again, that's particularly vulnerable are bisexuals. And I've seen so many cases in the UK of bisexual people seeking asylum who are assumed, well, you don't have to worry about any violence that happens to homosexuals in your country because aren't you lucky? You can choose. So, just don't be gay, be hetero, and you'll be fine. You have the choice. These bizarre expectations and ideas about people's sexual orientation seem to persist even in countries where you might think they would have a better idea, but they do also act as barriers. They deter people from talking about what really happened to them and what impact it has had on them. I should probably shut up at this point.
Well, I want to touch on something that Jane raised about as lawyers respecting other professionals and what they can bring to the table. And I think one of the obvious sort of consequences of making disclosures is often trauma that a victim may suffer or experience. From your professional experience, how do you manage that? Or professionally, how can one manage that, whether they're a legal professional or a medical professional? Because I know that Jane was talking about something similar to what you said a moment ago, building trust. And when she talked about making sure that there's adequate accommodation, the basics, food, education, that they feel safe before they can open up to a legal professional. I wondered when looking at trauma specifically, what's your experience of that? How is that managed professionally if it can be?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this is something that it's hard always to prepare for it because you never know when it's going to happen. If you don't already know what the person is going to talk about before you see them, then you don't know if they're going to make a disclosure and whether it's a disclosure that they've made a number of times to people or whether this is the first time they've ever talked about that experience. So I think it is helpful to have some sense of when you're in the first phase of an interview or talking to somebody, getting to know a little bit about their current situation so that you have an idea of what might happen to them when they leave. And certainly if you haven't done it already, you need to do it before they leave if they have suddenly made a big disclosure to you and seem to be very distressed about it. Part of closing the interview as a process is bringing the person back to the here and now, talking about their journey, how will they get to where they live, what is it like where they live, who else is there? Is there somebody there that they do talk to, not necessarily about this stuff, but about anything? Do they even speak to the other people that they share accommodation with? And if they don't speak to them, is there somebody around that they do speak to? Just in terms of, are you alive? Are you feeling okay? Levels of conversation. So a safety net process where you check who might this person be able to talk to, just to kind of feel that they're alive, that they're here, that they're not back there, to keep them in the present, in the here and now, is very important. And also to ask sometimes about what will they do if they feel worse, because quite often people will say they're okay, they go home and then they say, oh, well, I had a terrible night, I couldn't sleep, I was terrified to go to sleep, then I had the nightmares, worse than I've ever had, because the conversation that you've had with them has brought up a lot of memories that they've been trying to lock away in boxes, and now they're up there fresh in their mind and they can't get rid of them. And that can obviously raise their risk of self-harm, suicide, because of the mental distress. So as much as possible, I might, if I've identified some risk factors on those lines, I would then talk about, well, what will you do if you feel worse later on, tonight, tomorrow? Who will you talk to? Is there someone you would call? Can you go to your doctor? Can you go round to your friend or your cousin? Can you stay indoors where you feel a bit safer? Just try to talk through how they will manage, because I guess in the UK I'm in that fortunate position where the people who've made it are pretty resilient by definition because they've got that far. So we try to just reconnect with those resiliences that they clearly have, and get them to recognise that they do have some strengths. They have survived up to this point. What's helped them to do that? And just bring those up to the surface as well. Give them phone numbers. Talk about who they can contact when they feel desperate. So all of that kind of process is, I think, really important. There's stuff you can do in the moment if somebody's very distressed, and grounding techniques, reassurance techniques. These are all things that I would work through in training with people as well, which I think are important to know, because you can't always predict what's going to trigger someone to have a flashback in front of you, or to become uncontrollably distressed.
Thank you for that. Just opening it up to the floor again, are there any other barriers that people can identify in terms of making those disclosures, reporting experiences of gender-based violence?
Yeah, I'm straight as well. We've had, just particularly on the forced marriage area,
Yeah.
we've had forced marriage visitation program for a long time, but most young women don't want to access them because of the consequence on maintaining within their communities. So there is a barrier, if you like, a conflict between the legal profession and the legal policy project, which runs cases. They want to see persecutions taken up, they want to actually see action taken. So to get support through that program, you actually have to agree to actually take action. That's usually a family member or a community member. And so young people, young women in particular, want to actually follow through on that process because they don't want to see their family member potentially jailed and the court potentially if the rules abuser around that. So the legal system itself creates a solution, but also the barrier.
And I think I agree with your observation from a UK perspective as well. Certainly as a family practitioner, I noticed a difference when forced marriage was criminalised a few years ago. And I was of the view that actually that would be counterproductive to certainly young women coming forward and wanting to disclose that they're being subjected to a forced marriage or at risk of that for exactly those reasons, that they don't want to cause difficulties for their families or indeed their parents, and often it's their parents that are unfortunately instigators of the forced marriage or complicit. So yeah, I think it's unfortunately a similar situation where I'm from too. It's worth knowing some statistics as well, I think, just to bring this into context, that when we are talking about gender-based violence, even though people may be fleeing from gender-based violence to, for example, the UK, there are still very disturbing statistics around that. For example, if we look at the global statistics, for example, that I was able to pull out from the World Health Organization, almost it estimates that as many as 38% of murders of women are committed by a male intimate partner. That's talking about it in the context of domestic abuse. But also UK statistics that I was able to look at before coming here. According to Women's Aid, and this is a leading UK-based domestic violence charity, 2 women are killed by their partner every week in England and Wales. I know that we've got statistics from Australia as well, that female homicides as a result of male violence, it's understood 60 women were killed in Australia in the year 2018 to date. By contrast, those killed in the past 100 years through terrorism is 20, but of course issues like deaths through terrorism receive greater publicity and media attention, and also attract more funding as well. So it's worth looking at this in the context of not only what is happening in countries where women have experienced gender-based violence by regimes, or where governments have not taken a strong stance against that, but also comparing that with countries such as the UK, Australia, and so forth. One thing that I'm very alive to is, certainly in the UK, how sometimes there can be almost a double standard of approach when dealing with refugee women who've experienced gender-based violence and those who are born and settled in the UK. Now, if there is a victim of gender-based violence who seeks the protection of the authorities, they will have the support of the police. The police's approach, there's been lots of training around this, is one to make the complainant, the victim, feel secure and at ease in terms of making that disclosure. Now, by way of example, if the police are interviewing a victim who